Between 1937 and 1945, in a facility buried in the Manchurian countryside, Japanese military scientists conducted experiments on living human beings. Not animals, not volunteers, prisoners, captured soldiers and civilians, who were referred to in official documentation not by name, but by a single Japanese word, maruta. Maruta means log. These were human beings, reduced to lumber, and when the war ended, the men who ran this place did not face a courtroom. They were given immunity in exchange for their data. The facility was officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Every word of that name was chosen to deceive. Located near the town of Pingfang, in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, the compound stretched across 6 square kilometers. It had its own airstrip, its own prison, its own crematorium. At its peak, it employed over 3,000 personnel, physicians, researchers, military officers, technicians. The man who built it was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a physician who believed that biological warfare would define the next century of human conflict. He was not wrong about that. He was simply willing to do whatever it took to be ready. Shiro Ishii was born in 1892 in Chibayama, Japan, into a family of landowners. He studied medicine at Kyoto Imperial University, graduating in 1920. By conventional measure, he was brilliant, and by institutional measure, he was relentless. His military career advanced quickly, and by the late 1920s, he had begun arguing forcefully within Japanese military circles for a dedicated biological warfare research program. His argument was simple and chilling. Every major world power was either developing biological weapons or seriously considering it. Japan, he said, could not afford to fall behind. In 1930, Ishii traveled through Europe and the United States, studying military medicine and international conventions on warfare. He returned convinced that the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which banned the use of biological and chemical weapons, was not a moral statement. It was a competitive advantage waiting to be exploited. Countries that signed it, he reasoned, did so because they feared such weapons would be used against them. To Ishii, that fear was proof of efficacy. He began petitioning the Japanese Army Ministry directly. He was persuasive, he was politically connected, and he was willing to say out loud what others would only think in private. By 1932, he had convinced the Imperial Army to fund a covert research program. He established his first facility at Joma Fortress, in occupied Manchuria, far from international observers, far from journalists, and far from anyone who might object. The choice of location was not incidental. Manchuria, invaded and occupied by Japan in 1931, offered something no facility on Japanese soil could: complete impunity. The local population had no political protection. Prisoners had no legal recourse, and the remoteness of the site ensured that even rumors would take years to surface. Ishii understood something most war criminals discover too late: that the machinery of atrocity requires not just willing participants, but structural invisibility. He built both simultaneously. By 1936, he had secured imperial backing, a direct mandate from the Japanese government, for expanded operations. The facility near Pingfang began construction in 1935, built by thousands of Chinese laborers. Most of those laborers were killed afterward to protect the secrecy of what they had constructed. The compound that rose from that labor had its own power plant, its own hospital, its own frostbite research ward, its own bomb testing range. And, this detail matters, a fully operational prison capable of holding up to 400 prisoners at any one time. Those prisoners were the research subjects. They were called Maruta. They were never released. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 were not random acts of sadism. That is critical to understand. They were methodical, documented, peer-reviewed within the facility, and designed to generate actionable military intelligence. The horror was bureaucratic. It had filing systems. It had research protocols. It had career advancement opportunities for the scientists who produced the most useful results. This was not a dungeon. It was a laboratory, and that distinction is what makes it so difficult to absorb. The first systematic experiments focused on infectious disease. Prisoners were infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and other pathogens, not through natural exposure, but through deliberate injection, contaminated food, or infected fleas released into sealed chambers. Researchers recorded the progression of disease with clinical precision: body temperature, organ function, time to incapacitation, time to death. The objective was to determine the most effective delivery mechanisms for biological weapons under field conditions. The research was goal-oriented. The subjects were incidental. Alongside the disease experiments, Unit 731 researchers conducted vivisections, surgical operations on living, conscious human beings, to study the effects of disease on internal organs without the distortion caused by post-mortem decomposition. Survivors who later testified, and there were almost none, described prisoners being operated on while fully conscious because anesthesia was believed to alter the physiological data. This was not a failure of protocol. This was the protocol. Frostbite experiments were conducted during Manchuria's brutal winters. Prisoners were forced to submerge their limbs in ice water or left exposed to sub-zero temperatures until tissue froze solid. Researchers then tested various rewarming methods: hot water, fire, dry heat, friction, recording which produced the most severe damage and which, if any, produced recovery. The data was incorporated into Japanese military medical manuals. Pressure experiments placed prisoners in sealed chambers and gradually altered atmospheric pressure until eardrums ruptured, lungs collapsed, and in some documented cases, the eyes, under extreme pressure differential, were forced partially from their sockets. These were not edge cases. These were scheduled experiments, assigned to specific researchers on specific days, logged in facility records. Unit 731 also functioned as a weapons testing range. Prisoners were restrained at measured distances in open fields and exposed to artillery shells filled with plague-infected fleas or anthrax-laced shrapnel. Researchers in protective suits then tracked the spread of infection and calculated lethality ratios. The results were forwarded to Imperial Army planning divisions. Between 1937 and 1945, Unit 731 and its affiliated units, Unit 100, Unit 1644, Unit 8604, are conservatively estimated to have killed between 3,000 and 12,000 people within their facilities. The range is wide because many records were destroyed, but the lower bound alone, 3,000 human beings, killed methodically in the name of science, is itself nearly impossible to absorb. And what happened inside the compound was only part of what Unit 731 was doing. What happened inside Unit 731's walls was contained, controlled, documented, confined. What happened outside those walls is harder to quantify, and in many ways, harder to confront, because Unit 731 was not only a research facility, it was a weapons production and deployment center. And beginning in 1940, It went operational. In October of that year, Japanese military aircraft dropped plague-infected fleas over the city of Ningbo, on China's eastern coast. Weeks later, similar drops were made over Chuzhou and Jinhua. The plague outbreaks that followed killed hundreds, possibly thousands, of civilians. Survivors described rats dying in the streets first, then people. Entire neighborhoods were quarantined. Chinese medical authorities, with almost no resources and no understanding of what was being deployed against them, could not contain the spread. They were fighting a weapon they did not know existed. In 1941, operations were conducted over Changde, in Yunnan province. Japanese aircraft dropped what appeared to be grain and fragments of cotton, materials designed to attract rats and insects, contaminated with cholera and plague bacteria. The operation was later confirmed by both Japanese and Chinese military records. And what the records also confirm is this: researchers from Unit 731 traveled to the sites of these operations afterward to collect field data, measuring outbreak patterns, infection rates, and mortality. They were studying their own attacks. The scale of Japan's biological warfare campaign across China between 1940 and 1945 remains disputed among historians. Conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands of civilians died as a direct result. Some Chinese researchers, accounting for secondary spread through populations with no medical infrastructure, place the number in the hundreds of thousands. The difficulty in reaching a precise figure is compounded by one fact that history cannot work around. Japan has never fully acknowledged these operations. Official Japanese government positions continue to dispute the scope and intent of Unit 731's field activities. The testimonies of Japanese veterans who participated in these operations are among the most chilling documents produced by the 20th century. Sergeant Yuichi Yoshida, interviewed decades after the war, described participating in plague flea drops with the calm detachment of a man recounting a logistics exercise. Other veterans, interviewed by Japanese journalists in the 1990s, described watching villages go silent within weeks of an operation. They did not express guilt. They expressed professional assessment. By 1945, Ishii's team had developed bombs capable of delivering plague, anthrax, and typhoid at scale. They had drawn up operational plans, known as Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, to use aircraft to drop plague-infected fleas on the western coast of the United States. The bombs were ready. The fleas were ready. Only Japan's surrender in August 1945 prevented a biological attack on American soil. When Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria in August 1945, Ishii gave his final orders to the staff of Unit 731. They were to destroy the facility, detonate the buildings, incinerate the records, eliminate the remaining prisoners so that no witnesses survived. The order was executed with the same precision that had defined everything the facility did. The prisoners still alive in the cells were killed. The main complex was demolished. Thousands of documents were burned. But the data itself, the accumulated results of years of human experimentation, could not be destroyed. It existed in the minds of Ishii and his senior researchers. And that data was exactly what the United States Army wanted. American intelligence officers, operating under the authority of General Douglas MacArthur's post-war command in Japan, became aware of Unit 731 almost immediately after the surrender. The question they faced was not whether war crimes had been committed. That much was obvious. The question was whether those war crimes were more valuable as evidence for prosecution, or as proprietary research for the coming Cold War. They chose the latter. In a series of negotiations conducted between 1945 and 1948, The United States Army offered Ishii and his senior staff full immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for the complete data from their human experiments. The arrangement was formalized in secret. Ishii provided thousands of pages of research findings on frostbite tolerance, plague transmission, anthrax delivery, cholera progression, gas gangrene, data that no ethical research program could ever have generated, because no ethical research program could have used human beings the way Unit 731 had. The United States absorbed that data into its own biological warfare research. It did not ask how it was obtained. Brigadier General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's chief of intelligence, was central to this decision. Internal memos declassified by the United States government decades later confirmed that American officers were fully aware they were granting immunity to men whose acts were equivalent to those being prosecuted at Nuremberg at that very moment. They proceeded anyway. The justification, recorded in those same documents, was Cold War necessity. The Soviet Union was developing its own biological warfare program. The United States could not afford to discard Unit 731's research on ideological grounds. Mass murder, in this calculus, had a utilitarian value. Shiro Ishii died in 1959 of throat cancer in Tokyo. A free man. He faced no charges, gave no public accounting, and left behind no admission of responsibility. Many of his senior researchers, men who had managed the prisoner supply chain, conducted vivisections, and overseen field deployments, went on to distinguished post-war careers. They became university professors, hospital directors, pharmaceutical executives. The Soviet Union, for its own political purposes, prosecuted 12 Unit 731 members at the Khabarovsk war crimes trial in 1949. But the Soviets had separately extracted their own data from Japanese sources, and the trial served as much as Cold War propaganda as it did justice. The cover-up was not the act of a single government protecting a single secret. It was a structural decision, made coldly and deliberately, to absorb the products of mass murder into the architecture of post-war science. Unit 731 did not end when the bombs detonated and the records burned. It ended on a bargaining table, in a quiet, classified negotiation that history kept hidden for decades. The files were declassified slowly and reluctantly. In the United States beginning in the 1990s, in Japan partially and incompletely, and in some cases not at all. No official apology has ever been issued by the Japanese government specifically for Unit 731's activities. The data obtained through human experimentation remains part of the scientific and military record, its origins acknowledged in academic literature, its full influence impossible to trace and impossible to fully excise. What you have just heard is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented history, the history of governments, militaries, and scientific institutions deciding, in plain language and formal memoranda, that Satan human lives were acceptable collateral in the pursuit of strategic advantage. They made that calculation once. The question history keeps asking, quietly, persistently, is whether it has ever truly stopped.